the U.S. Secret Service declined to comment. Obviously, a lot of sensitive issues surrounding the president's security for sure, but a lot of questions as well, given that plane still flew out without the president on it.
Without the president on it. And
other people
also
on it.
With members of the press on it. You know, Jonathan Lemire, talk about how much these threats from Iran have impacted the White House. Obviously, we saw in the first term when Soleimani was killed, that you had threats against the president. John Bolton, very clearly against John Bolton. Pompeo, Brian Hook, for some reason I'm still trying to figure out. You can go down the list. In the second term, though, obviously, after Donald Trump ordered the killing of not only the top leader, but also the generals, obviously, he's on their list. He's said as much. He's at times sounded a bit down about it. But here shows just how real that threat was to him, according to the Secret Service, that they went through this almost like James Bond type ritual to get him off one plane and onto another.
Yeah, this is an extraordinary development here. It underscores how seriously they took the threat. First, you're right. Since the Soleimani killing, there has been a sense that Iran has been coming for President Trump. And in fact, we know from reporting, including in Maggie and Jonathan Swan's book, that when even the Butler, Pennsylvania shooting attempt happened a few years ago, the first thought was Iran behind this? And certainly since this conflict ignited earlier this year, there's been a real sensitivity and concern that Iran would try something. But this is extraordinary. I mean, I've flown on Air Force One for years as part of the press pool, never experienced anything like this. It's only happened once or twice before that people can remember in the history of the presidency. To the fact that, first of all, there was already, as you noted, the controversy about the Qatar Air Force One. That was deemed unsafe for President Trump to use to fly out of Turkey, out of that NATO summit, once the hostilities began in neighboring Iran. Turkey and Iran share a border. But the fact that they didn't even put him on the traditional Air Force One, which does really have significant security measures, which is a White House in the sky, that President George W. Bush flew in the hours after September 11th. And the fact that they separated Trump from the press pool is also pretty unprecedented. Even when presidents, including Trump, have flown into war zones like Iraq or Afghanistan, they sometimes would take a military aircraft, or they would the trip would not be advised publicly until it was over, but the press would still travel with the president. So the fact that the press, senior members of the White House staff were still on Air Force One, and there were inner circle members of the Trump administration who only learned that the president wasn't on their aircraft days later. It goes to show you just how extraordinary seriously the Secret Service took this threat, that they used this ruse with the cart there in Turkey and put the president and a couple aides, including Secretary Hegseth, on that smaller unmarked plane.
Yeah, White House aides and the press on a plane that was the target of an active
decoy
threat and used as a decoy. We're glad the president is safe. We know Iran has publicly threatened revenge against him, so they take these very seriously. Meanwhile, President Trump is again emphasizing economic pressure on Iran as the war drags on and the stalemate over the Strait of Hormuz continues. In a post on Truth Social yesterday, Trump said since Iran is seeking war reparations, he intends to do the same. Writing he, quote, is demanding compensation from Iran for the deaths of U.S. soldiers and Iranian civilians in recent decades. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman pushed back against the pivot to economic pressure, saying, quote, whenever Washington proves itself incapable of pursuing diplomacy, it retreats into sanctions. And whenever those sanctions fail to produce results, it simply increases the dose. He went on to say the real risk is that American politicians clinging to this bad habit will instead strangle their own remaining chances of a less humiliating exit from a crisis of their own making. That's from Iran. President Trump was pressed by reporters yesterday about what comes next.
You said this last round of talks was Iran's last chance before decapitation. So what now? What comes next?
You'll find out.
Are you still, are massive escalation, is that still on the table?
Well, we have that, certainly that ability if we want to do that. Yeah, you'll find out.
Let's bring in decorated combat veteran and former commander of U.S. Army Europe, retired Army Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. He is an MS Now military analyst. General, it's great to have you with us this morning. So you heard the president there saying we still reserve the right to use this massive force that he says the United States still can deploy despite all of the reporting up and down the line. And I know you've talked to people in defense production industry of missiles and things like that, that we are depleted in our stockpiles and that threat may ring hollow to Iran. So what did you make of the president's view of this war that he says he's kind of taking a low-key approach to?
Again, Willie, we're talking about the approach to any kind of combat operations. When you send America's sons and daughters into war, you normally coordinate the various elements of national power. Those include the military, the economic system, diplomacy, and information. And what we're seeing is a swap back and forth between the different types of power. We've been using military for the last couple of months, and that's been an on-again, off-again kind of situations where the president's trying to measure how effective it is, hopefully how it will influence Iran to do the bidding. That hasn't worked very well. And as you said, I wouldn't use the word depleted in terms of ammunition. I would say degraded significantly. But I think the president has finally gotten that message from his military advisors and said, we can't continue just using military power. So now he's switching back to economic power to try and squeeze them, as you just said. But the question then becomes, as he's doing this, he's also continuing with the insults and the approaches to Iran that just kind of counter the actions of diplomacy and also information warfare. In the White House yesterday, when he says, you'll see, that doesn't truthfully assuage me that he's got a good approach to all of this. He's trying different methods, not coordinating all of them at the same time. And unfortunately, I think he knows deep down, and his advisors have probably told him, that he is losing his capability to influence Iran. So saying economic pressure, that economic pressure always takes a long time. You can swat something with a baseball bat using the military power. But when you're talking about economic power, there's a lot of determination of how the enemy will react. And as we've said so many times on this show, the enemy always gets a vote. Will Iran be able to understand that their their existence depends on this and just do the same thing they've done over the last several decades in the face of economic sanctions and just carry on?